All right, thank you for joining us tonight for another Socialist Action Monday night webinar. Tonight, our topic is the fight against US sanctions and intervention. We have a great panel here with us tonight. We have Joe Lombardo, the National Co-Coordinator of the United National Anti-War Coalition, UNAC, which Socialist Action is an active member, and Joe is also a longtime anti-war activist. We have Ike Nahem from the National Network on Cuba. He's an organizer of the New York and New Jersey Cuba Sea Coalition and a retired locomotive engineer and proud Teamster, who's also been published in Counterpunch and Monthly Review and various other places. We also have Cynthia Papermaster, who is the coordinator of the Bay Area-wide Golden Gate chapter of CodePINK, Women for Peace, a women-led international grassroots peace and justice organization that is well known in the anti-war and anti-sanctions struggles. And Cynthia works on CodePINK campaigns opposing US sanctions and divesting from the war economy, as well as many other things. We also have Rick Sterling, who's an investigative journalist, president of Task Force on the Americas, and a member of the Syrian Solidarity Movement and the Mountain Diablo Peace and Justice Center, here to tell us about Syria. And coming to us and joining us from Venezuela tonight, William Camacaro is going to be one of our speakers. He's the co-founder of the Alberto Lovera Bolivarian Circle of New York and is an artist, radio host, and activist in New York City. So we'll start with Joe Lombardo.
Thank you, Nick. As Nick mentioned, I'm a longtime anti-war activist. I actually started my anti-war activism back in the Vietnam War period. And in my lifetime, I think there's been 3 significant periods of anti-war activism. And they've all been very, very different depending upon the circumstances of the particular time. The first was the Vietnam anti-war movement. During that period, I, for a time, was a staff person on one of the 2 major anti-war coalitions that organized some of the massive actions that took place during that time, the National Peace Action Coalition. In the 80s, there was a very massive, significant movement, anti-nuclear movement that took place in the United States. And I think it was largely responsible for a number of the international treaties that the United States signed on to against nuclear weapons and to try to cap the ability of countries to build and use and test nuclear weapons. And I think the modern anti-war period really started with the US invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq and a number of other countries now that we've been in with military force of various kinds. And I do think this period is different than the other ones in a lot of ways. First of all, the technologies are very, very different. We don't have a draft, we have an economic draft, which in some ways ensures that the soldiers and the GIs are more working class. They go into the military because there's a lack of jobs, because there's a lack of potential to go to college and similar reasons. And I think that has some interesting connotations in the long run for the anti-war movement. But I think the US has also learned from some of the lessons of the past. And is afraid to see the kind of mass actions that and the power that was behind them in some of these other periods. And so did not opt to use a draft and did opt to use this kind of economic draft. but it also moved towards other kinds of warfare in a greater amount. There's many, many different kinds of war. The wars that we're familiar with most are, the invasions and the occupations, such as took place in Afghanistan and Iraq and Vietnam and some other places. But we talk a lot about hybrid wars now and different forms that have taken. The US has more and more moved towards wars that don't create large numbers of casualties for US soldiers, because they know that can turn the people quickly against war and can help build a mass movement that can really oppose them in a very powerful way. So they've used other forms of wars. They used drone warfare, for instance, something that was not really available in the past wars. Unmanned drones that can basically kill people with bombs and weapons. They use a lot more air wars in general. They use proxy armies. And the interesting thing in these proxy armies is it doesn't matter who they are. If they can get them, they'll use them, Osama bin Laden was an ally of the United States when he went to Afghanistan to fight against the Soviet troops and the government that was backed by the Soviet in there. And then he became the US enemy as he built Al-Qaeda and 9/11 happened and so forth. But then in Syria, we saw basically the United States becoming allies with Al-Qaeda, with the al-Nusra Front and against ISIS. And in Syria, for instance, they were able to bring in mercenaries. Numbers I've heard are substantially above 100,000 people from foreign countries to try to overthrow the Syrian government. So these proxy armies and troops, mercenaries have been used a lot. But another important form is sanctions. And some anti-war activists have actually said, well, sanctions are better than war. So in some sense, they supported them. But sanctions are not better than war. Sanctions are war. When we use sanctions between the period of the Gulf War and the shock and awe war that took place in Iraq, the United Nations estimated that those sanctions were responsible for 1.5 million deaths in Iraq. That's a massive number of deaths. The United Nations Children's Fund, UNICEF, said that 500,000 children in Iraq were killed by these sanctions. And there was a famous statement by Madeleine Albright saying, recognizing that 500,000, 500,000 children were killed in Iraq due to US imposed sanctions. But she said she thought it was worth it. This is the criminality of the governments that we have that impose these sanctions today on perhaps 39 countries in one report that I read recently. And sanctions are not benign by any means. You can tell that by numbers that die from these sanctions. They kill many, many people. It's not just that the US won't trade with these countries, but it goes far deeper. The US will not often trade with countries that trade with these countries. They often will not let ships that have traded with these countries come into US ports for periods of time. And so countries have to make the calculation of, will they trade with Cuba? Will they trade with another country? Or will they need to support their own economy by trading with the US. I have 1 minute left, so I'm not going to continue along this line, but there's a lot more that I could say. But I just want to say during the COVID-19 crisis, sanctions have really shown their face. the United States has upped the sanctions against countries like Venezuela and Iran, not allowing medical equipment, not allowing medicines into these countries that are hurting. And this is exactly the opposite of the international solidarity shown by many other countries like Cuba and China that have sent doctors and materials to these countries. And so sanctions is a very important part of the anti-war movement today. And that's why UNAC helped form the new coalition, Sanctions Kill Coalition, which you can see the website there, sanctionskill.org. And it's something that we all have to come together in the anti-war movement to fight today. So thank you.
All right. Thank you, Joe. Our next speaker is William Kamikaro, who's joining us from Venezuela, where it was just revealed this week that the United States has been using $600 million that it seized from Venezuela in Venezuelan assets to build Trump's border wall along the US-Mexico border. So thank you for joining us, William.
Better tell him he's muted.
I think you need to unmute.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yes, thank you very much for inviting me. Right now I'm in Valencia, in Carabobo State, 2 hours and a half from Caracas. Basically, have been here since January. So I have been here all this year. We have been unable to go back because there are no international flights in Venezuela due to the pandemic. Basically, the sanctions are creating a huge inflation in the country. The prices are getting up all the time. Everything is getting up, expensive. The scarcity of certain medicine, food, scarcity in equipment, and also equipment to repair cars or equipment to repair anything in the country is very difficult to get those equipment now, thanks to the sanctions. And also it's very there is and the big problem is the health problem, the problem of the medicine here, because we have a big pandemic and the countries that are the neighboring Venezuela. Colombia is right now facing a huge problem with the COVID-19. Brazil is facing a big problem with the COVID-19, and we are receiving a lot of immigrants, Venezuelan immigrants coming back right now to Venezuela, and many of them are sick. So that could be a big problem for Venezuelan government, for the revolution. A lot of people are saying here that the right-wing governments in the area are sending Venezuelan, immigrants back as a biological weapons against the Bolivarian revolution. Right now, Venezuela has more than 3,000 cases with COVID-19. Every day we have more than 100 cases every day. And most of those cases are coming from Colombia and from Brazil. And that represents a huge problem when you realize that we are talking that we are in a country that is facing a huge blockade and sanctions from the United States. And very, very difficult to get some medicine, very difficult to get some equipment for hospital. And so that situation really is a challenge situation in the face of this pandemic. The other huge problem for Venezuela is not only the sanctions, it's the everyday mention of the military action against Venezuela. So when you see all the militaries that the United States is sending to Colombia right now, they are sending around 800 or more, 800 militaries to Colombia. They have already 9 military bases over there. They are using all the military bases that they have in the Caribbean Sea. A lot of people here said that we don't have Venezuela in the north in the north has as a neighbor NATO, because a big number of these islands are connected with European countries, and basically NATO, they have some kind of military base there from NATO. So, so we know, for example, that Holland is sending soldiers to Aruba, Netherlands. That is a big problem for Venezuela and for people here. And also, another big problem that Venezuela is trying to resolve is the problem of the gasoline. They remind me when Argentina have a lot of problem, Argentinian people have a lot of problem to get food. And Argentina is a country that produces a lot of food. But, you know, there was a moment during the crisis, during 20 years ago, that they faced this crisis that they didn't have enough food. But Venezuela didn't have enough gasoline. So you see, until just a few weeks ago, huge lines of people, long lines of people for 12 hours, 2 days, 3 days, lines of cars to trying to get gasoline, at least 20 liters, 30 liters of gasoline. So that was a big problem. Fortunately, Venezuela has been able to overcome, thanks to the support of Iran, some of those issues with the gasoline. And one of the main problems is that thanks to the sanctions, Venezuela cannot repair the refinery, cannot get equipment to maintain the logistics for those refineries, but also cannot get some of the chemicals that the country needs to process the oil. So that's a big problem that still is going, we will be facing that problem for several more weeks. And the other problem is the military, very quickly, the military, all the warships, I have a minute, warships in the Caribbean that made everything more difficult for people here to see how everything is so difficult daily, every day, and to see that all these military forces are surrounding the country. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, William. Our next speaker is Rick Sterling, who is an expert on Syria.
Hi, everyone. It's nice to be here talking about a rather grim topic. What William was describing from Venezuela is somewhat similar to Syria, which is one of the countries under the most severe sanctions by the United States. Actually, this month, we're having an escalation of the US sanctions regime. And I've written, as part of an article that's forthcoming here, a description of it. So I'll read that and then I'll comment after that. The sanctions on Syria are a brutal act of war. Having failed in the attempt to militarily overthrow the Damascus government, the enemies of Syria, led by the USA, are trying to strangle it economically. These measures are hidden behind a cloud of lies and disinformation, so most Americans are not aware of what is happening. This month, June 2020, the U.S. has escalated a hybrid war on the Syrian people. The new law is called the Syria Civil Protection Act. It is embedded in the National Defense Authorization of 2020. It is called Caesar in reference to a 2014 hoax involving an anonymous Syrian who claimed to be a military photographer, with 55,000 photos showing about 11,000 torture victims of the Syrian state. In fact, it was later revealed that almost half of the photographs show the opposite of what's claimed. They show dead Syrian soldiers and civilians who were victims of several car bombs and attacks. Far from protecting civilians, this measure is going to directly hurt millions of Syrians. It will undoubtedly result in thousands dying needlessly. The new U.S. law is a good demonstration of the U.S. as world bully and supremacist. The law says that the U.S. restrictions on trade with Syria apply not just to U.S. citizens, but all nationalities. That is, the U.S. is imposing its laws on everyone around the world. They will seek to punish any company or individual that trades with Syria. It will threaten any company from doing business with Syria. That includes Lebanese companies that have facilitated exports and imports from Syria that were crucial in the past. That includes Lebanese banks, where it's already impossible for a Syrian citizen to open a bank account. The new U.S. law will make it impossible to deal with a Syrian central bank, which they have claimed is a, quote, primary money laundering, unquote, institution. No lie is too big for Washington. So that's what we've got coming right now. The impact of these of the new laws have been seen in the currency crash of the last several weeks. When I was in Syria last October, it was 650 Syrian pounds to the dollar. Today it's at 2,400, 2,400. That's how much it has fallen. The Lebanese banks are being hammered very hard, and last year in April 2019, Mike Pompeo went to Beirut and told them, he threatened them that they needed to stop working with Syria, they needed to stop facilitating Hezbollah, which of course which is a part of the government in Lebanon, and he basically laid out the terms that were impossible to comply with, and so we've seen the consequences of the fall of the Lebanese banks went through a crisis that had been in existence for 20 years. It folded off operations in 5 days. So the crisis in Syria and Lebanon has been a main partner. The crisis in Lebanon is having vast repercussions in Syria, and this is all being done intentionally by U.S. intervention. Regarding the sanctions, I can recount just a personal anecdote of the effect of this. I went to Syria in 2015 and a friend, and later on a friend contacted me about a young boy that he knew that was hard of hearing. The problem was that his hearing aid had run out of batteries. He got batteries. It took me a year to get batteries to help him, just for this one case. You've got you have expensive medical machines, dialysis machines, MRI machines in hospitals. If they're made by GE or they're made by the German company Siemens, and they need a spare part, it's almost impossible to get that spare part. So you have equipment that is essential in running a hospital that can't be made operable. Before the war, before the crisis, 90% of the pharmaceutical needs in Syria were supplied by pharmaceutical manufacturing plants in Syria. The war has devastated that. And now, as we know, the Syrian government has reclaimed major parts of the country, except for the Idlib province in the north and eastern Syria. Idlib in the north is controlled by predominantly, which is the Al-Qaeda franchise in Syria, and in the east it's controlled by the U.S. and a puppet force. But elsewhere, the Syrian government has reclaimed the country, whether it's in homes or in the outskirts of Damascus or in the bigger city, in the industrial city of Aleppo. 500,000 civilians in 2018, 500,000 civilians had returned to Aleppo, hoping to reestablish after the terrorist war failed, and yet they are prevented from doing that. Why? Because under the U.S. sanctions, they get to rebuild their houses. They're not allowed to rebuild their houses. The UN says that they can use plastic to make windows, but they can't install proper windows with glass and wood frames. So there's a whole host of problems and restrictions that makes life extremely difficult, and it's only going to get worse with the imposition of this so-called Caesar Act. The UN expert on Syria has this. He says it's one of the most severe and severe imposition of sanctions that has ever been enforced. So basically, the struggle continues. The Syrian people defeated terrorist forces that were trying to destroy them militarily, and now they're dealing with these coercive economic sanctions, and everybody in the West needs to be aware of what's going on.
Thank you, Rick. Thanks. We are having a little bit of audio trouble when you were speaking, so I don't know if possibly we may need to maybe turn off the video or something next time around. Yeah, see if that helps. Thanks. But that was fantastic info on how the United States is using sanctions, as Joe said earlier, as just one of its forms of warfare these days against Syria. Cynthia is our next speaker, Cynthia Papermaster from CodePINK.
Hello, everybody. You know, Nicholas, maybe don't post that article that I said. I was gonna ask people to follow along. I'm in Berkeley, California, and I thank you very much for inviting me to be on this call tonight. I've been working on the question of sanctions relief for a couple of months now. One of the reasons that I'm so involved with this issue is that economic sanctions are a form of collective punishment, and collective punishment is something I'm morally opposed to. And what is collective punishment? If you ask yourself that question, it's punishing innocent people for the actions, in this case, of the government, which the United States is opposed to and wants to effect regime change. So we're punishing everyone in Iran, Venezuela, Syria, Yemen, North Korea, etc., expecting that they will rise up and challenge their government or overthrow their government. And that just doesn't happen. Anyway, CodePINK is working to get sanctions lifted. And one thing we want to do is get Nancy Pelosi, Speaker of the House, to get behind some legislation that will lift the sanctions. There have been some efforts in Congress already. Several of those efforts involve letters to Trump and Pompeo, asking them to lift the sanctions in the midst of a global pandemic. And we're using that as leverage to try to get to her and the so-called Democratic leadership in the House of Representatives. In the Senate, there's been legislation introduced already to get sanctions lifted during the pandemic. I think 5 senators, all Democrats, have asked for sanctions to be lifted. I don't believe that that is popular legislation. I don't believe that they're getting a lot of support for that. But we're not giving up right now. We really are trying very hard to get more representatives and senators to sign on. So we oppose sanctions based on the fact that they're deadly, they're illegal, and they're ineffective. Those are the three opposition points. Of course, they're deadly. People have already spoken about that, but the fact that they can't get needed medical equipment and supplies in Iran, Venezuela, etc., are going to lead to thousands and thousands of deaths, unnecessary deaths. They are illegal. I just want to quote one thing about that. Let's see, sorry. Just a moment. Dennis Halliday was a UN Assistant Secretary General who served as humanitarian coordinator in Iraq. And he resigned from the UN in protest at the brutal sanctions on Iraq in 1998. He said comprehensive sanctions, when opposed by the UN Security Council or by a state on a sovereign country, are a form of warfare, a blunt weapon that inevitably punishes innocent citizens. If they're deliberately extended when their deadly consequences are known, sanctions can be deemed genocide. When US Ambassador Madeleine Albright said on CBS 60 Minutes in 1996 that killing 500,000 Iraqi children to try to bring down Saddam Hussein was worth it, the continuation of UN sanctions against Iraq met the definition of genocide. Modern-day economic sanctions and blockades are comparable with medieval sieges of towns. 21st century sanctions attempt to bring not just a town, but sovereign countries to their knees. UN Special Rapporteur Idris Jazari issued a forceful statement in response to the failed US-backed coup in Venezuela in January. He condemned coercion by outside powers as a violation of all norms of international law. Sanctions which can lead to starvation and medical shortages are not the answer to the crisis in Venezuela, Jazari said. Precipitating an economic and humanitarian crisis is not a foundation for the peaceful settlement of disputes. In addition, sanctions also violate Article 19 of the Charter of the Organization of American States, which explicitly prohibits intervention, quote, for any reason whatever in the internal or external affairs of any other state. It adds that it prohibits not only armed forces, but also any other form of interference or attempted threat against the personality of the state or against its political, economic, and cultural elements. Article 20 of the OAS Charter is equally pertinent. Quote, no state may use or encourage the use of coercive measures of an economic or political character in order to force the sovereign will of another state and obtain from it advantages of any kind. Okay, so they are ineffective. I just want to stress that in a 1997 study, Robert Pape, a professor at Dartmouth, said in his study called Why Economic Sanctions Do Not Work, he concluded that sanctions had only been successful in 5 out of 115 cases. So why do we use economic sanctions? Well, they are a failed form of economic warfare by the United States. We have to oppose them if we can. And we support the efforts of the Friends Committee on Legislative, let's say FCNL. Yeah, a bipartisan solution that they are proposing is that Congress should urge the administration to immediately issue a temporary general license to facilitate international humanitarian relief efforts for COVID-19. Such a license could help slow the spread of this virus globally and reduce the suffering of millions. So I'm going to end here thank you all, and let's keep up this work and try to lift these sanctions. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Cynthia. Our next speaker is Ike Nahem from the National Network on Cuba and New York, New Jersey, Cuba C. Cynthia is with CodePINK, and CodePINK is one of the leading organization that is pushing for the Nobel Peace Prize to be given to Cuba's international medical brigades, the Henry Reeve Brigades, which have sent thousands of doctors around the world, in addition to the tens of thousands who are already working around the world to fight the coronavirus heroically. Thank you, Ike.
Hi. Okay. Yeah. I'm not representing the National Network on Cuba, although I'm a member. I'm an organizer for New York, New Jersey, Cuba C. I want to thank Socialist Action for inviting me to participate in this excellent panel, and also for your decade after decade of unconditional support for the Cuban Revolution and your participation in broad, united fights against U.S. aggression. Cuba is the model for the sanctions regime that we're talking about, that has spread as the main form of U.S. aggression around the world, as Joe said in his opening remarks. Cuba is the model, the longest sanctions directed by the United States government against a country in the history of the United States. I think to say that we talk about the embargo, the blockade, the sanctions against Cuba. I think Fidel Castro many times said that none of those descriptions are really adequate. That really what it is an economic and political war that always constantly has the threat implicit in it of military intervention, and we certainly see that today. The political reality today with Cuba, Venezuela, it's highly contradictory political reality. On the one hand, we see that never before has Washington's historic anti-Cuba policies ever been more hated, and bipartisan policies been more hated, more isolated politically in the world than they are today. But at the same time, and this is also true about Venezuela, the anti-Cuba and anti-Venezuelan policies, but at the same time, these policies are deepening, they are accumulating, they are having a terrible impact in human and social and economic terms. But at the same time, this tells us, this contradictory situation, that they are weakened politically. And this is, at the end of the day, the most decisive thing. There have been, for example, over the last 6 months, 8 months, the last time I was in Cuba for anti-imperialist conference last November, I remember I was meeting with some Cuban organizers from the ECAP Friendship Society, and they were telling me that there was 83 separate sanctions that had been added under the Trump administration against Cuba. I think people have seen some of the most recent examples just in the last couple of weeks. The refusal, forcing Marriott hotel chain to close its one legal operation that existed in Cuba. The attempts and the implementation of canceling of remittances from Cuban Americans to their families in Cuba, and these are ones of many. And this is juxtaposed to what the world sees, and more people in the United States see because of our work and because of the many people that the Cuba resonates to. The amazing example of Cuban medical internationalism that we've seen in the Caribbean with 23 missions in the Caribbean, Africa, Italy, of doctors that have gone into the worst hit areas and provided tremendous medical care, starting with in China when the pandemic first broke out. The use in countries of Cuban treatments and medications that can boost the immune system, like interferon alpha B2B, recombinant, and others. And the world has seen this. While the Trump administration tried to steal face masks from Barbados, Cuban medical internationalists were going all over the Caribbean. Then we saw the obscenity of the horrific terrorist attack. I don't know, what was it, 70 rounds from a high automatic rifle that damaged the Jose Marti statue that has still not been condemned by the United States government. And yet, and after the murder of our brother George Floyd, example of Cuban internationalism, the very next day, the Cuban mission flew its flag at half staff in tribute and in memory and in solidarity with the struggles against police killings in the United States. So what has our movement been doing? We've taken advantage, I guess you could say, of this period, of this the pandemic, to organize. We had to reschedule our International Cuba Conference that had wide endorsement, including from everybody that's on this panel today and all the organizations represented by the people on this panel today. That was scheduled for last March 21st and 22nd in New York. We've rescheduled it now, hopefully November 14th, 15th. It'll be a hybrid conference, partly virtual and partly, if we can have a physical component, in New York City. We've organized a series of very successful webinars attended by and seen by thousands and thousands of people that we've gotten on our lists and that we're now building. We've organized a Saving Lives campaign with the Canadian Network on Cuba to organize for U.S. Cuba Canada medical collaboration. We publicize. We have a website which I hope my brother Isaac Saney from the Canadian Network is going to put in the chat, where our website and so on. So we are moving forward. We're taking advantage of this political openings, the isolation, the hatred against U.S. policy against Cuba to crack the armor of the blockade and the economic war in the next period. So this situation, this contradictory situation, we think working with everybody here and others is a chance for us to take the offensive and to deal some real blows to the sanction regime. And last point, just to also identify our movement and the anti-imperialist movement, the anti-sanctions movement, the anti-war movement, with the massive upsurge of thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, millions of young people in this country and around the world against police killings and the criminal injustice system in the United States that we have, that Cuba provides a very good example of the opposite, which maybe we can go into again in the second round. But thank you very much. And I think I'm under my time.
All right, thank you, Ike. And we're going to go to a second round with questions from the audience. So if you have any questions, please do put them in the chat box. And we've seen tonight how the United States uses sanctions as part of its arsenal in imperialist warfare against countries all over the world, against Cuba for 60 years, where the blockade has cost the Cuban, has cost Cuba, I believe, over $80 billion by their calculations. You have the military ships in Venezuela just off the coast that have recently been threatening Iranian fuel tankers, bringing fuel in a deal between Iran and Venezuela, the United States threatening to blockade Venezuela. We have seizures of tankers shipping fuel, potentially to Syria, that the U.S. is involved in just the economic warfare against all of these countries, in its old strategy of making the economy scream to try to force the governments of these countries to do what it wants, or to simply throw them out of office and put in its own puppet regimes. So we'll go to our second round. We have one question on Cuba. I think that Ike could possibly address, and other speakers perhaps, if you'd like. What explains this contradiction in Cuba and potentially elsewhere, but especially in Cuba, the massive imperialist sanctions against that country and its massive medical mobilization to combat COVID-19. And also we have a question on how do Cuban systems of patrols compare to the US police? But I think Rick Sterling has going to have to leave early tonight. So let's have Rick Sterling as our first speaker on the second round, if we could. Thanks, Rick.
Okay, thanks, Nick. And I'm glad that Ike made reference to the murder of George Floyd and the protests, because there's an analogy here. Of course, he died with a knee on the neck. He was asphyxiated. And in a lot of ways, we can look at countries under sanctions as a knee on the neck. By the United States, it's especially acute with Venezuela. It's especially acute with Cuba. The US is trying to strangle those countries. And I just want to make one point, that the effectiveness of the sanctions ultimately depends on other countries being willing to follow them, especially as the US is saying that its laws apply to other citizens and other companies. So it's essential that we break up the complicity of Europe, of Canada, of the other countries that go along with the US sanctions. I think, and this is where our own role becomes very important, because it's vital that other countries know that there is serious opposition and significant disagreement by the American people with those policies. It gives them more strength in saying no to the US when they know that there are hundreds of thousands and millions of Americans who vocally disagree with those policies. So I think, and that makes it vital that we express that support. The Sanctions Kill organization has an important petition online. CodePINK has done terrific work in this regard. So I think it's vital that we realize the importance of this, not just for letting our own government know, but maybe even more importantly, letting other governments in Europe and Canada and those countries that can maybe be influenced to separate from that, to not be complicit, to help them, to push them toward that position. So it's been a great, I think the Sanctions Kill website is important to look at. The CodePINK work on this is outstanding. So I hope that some of the listeners will do that and spread the word. Thanks, Nick.
All right, thank you for being with us tonight, Rick. And on that, why don't we go back in the same order we started to? So we could go to Joe Lombardo, who's been I think done some work with those Sanctions Kill events, including those incredible events, bringing together diplomats and representatives from countries who have been subject to U.S. sanctions and are coming together in these events to talk to U.S. audiences online in a way that is now everywhere in this coronavirus lockdown, and now we have all these Zoom events, and including being able to bring Venezuelan and Syrian and Iranian and Cuban diplomats to talk to people about the effects of U.S. sanctions.
Sure. Yes, with the COVID-19 lockdown, like every other organization, Sanctions Kill has tried to go online, and we've held a series of webinars that have been very interesting because in the two webinars that we've held, not only did many thousands tune into these webinars, but we were able to get ambassador level participants from Iran, Venezuela, Nicaragua, North Korea, Zimbabwe, Syria, Palestine, and Cuba. And, these countries are talking to each other. Some of them talk to each other on our webinar, but they are talking to each other, and they are trying to figure out ways around some of the sanctions, and they are trying to figure out ways to cooperate and to break the stranglehold of the United States. And the interesting thing is that some of the allies of the United States are either grumbling or breaking with the United States on some of these sanctions. So the European Union, for instance, when Trump decided to go back on the treaty that we made, the agreement we made with Iran, and break that treaty and then impose these high level of sanctions and up those sanctions during the COVID-19 period, some of them said no. Some of them have sent medical equipment in violation of those sanctions, have passed resolutions against those sanctions. The United Nations has said that they believe that war and sanctions should be stopped during the COVID crisis, and the United States has done exactly the opposite. So it's important that we try to drive those wedges in and try to break that alliance as much as possible. And even with these webinars, we have been able to play a role in that to some extent. But I think it's really important that people look at this upsurge that's happening, starting with the murder of George Floyd, because it says a lot. Though the United States has a lot of influence around the world because of economic reasons and is losing some of that influence because the economy of the United States is in real trouble. But the people of the United States also have a big influence. And I think this dovetails with some of the things that Rick Sterling just said. We have tried in Congress, people have tried in Congress for years and decades to get rid of some of these racist statues around the country, change the names of some of the roads that are named after Confederate leaders in the South. And they haven't been able to do it. But then this upsurge happens, and now they're coming down. Now they're talking about defunding the police. Who could have thought such a thing could happen? And as we came out in city after city and town after town, my small town in upstate New York has a population of 28,000 people, and 1,000 came out last week on a march for George Floyd. But it didn't just happen here. It's happening all over the world. When we take that step in mass action that can lead, it does lead. People look to us for that kind of leadership. They look to the American people to oppose this racist, imperialist government. Now, we in UNAC always talk about the wars at home as well as the wars abroad. And that's exactly what we're seeing in our communities today. But it also has to go the other way, that the people in the streets today have to see that there's an international component of the strangulation that has happened to George Floyd and what they do in the communities, in the Black communities. And that is these sanctions, that is these wars, that is what's happening in Venezuela, that is what we're trying to do to Cuba. And when they make that connection, we can bring together our movement in such a strong way that we can really end these sanctions, end these wars, end imperialism, and end this imperialist government, which is really what we need to do. Thanks.
Thank you, Joe. Very well said. Thank you for those remarks. And let's go to William Kamikaro, who's with us in Venezuela and as mentioned earlier, has been in Venezuela for some time now. And, you know, we talked about US sanctions, but also US interventions is in the name of our event tonight. And recently we've seen a US intervention into Venezuela in the form of the aborted incursion by the Silver Corps group training in Colombia, being monitored by the CIA, the leader of it tweeting at Donald Trump about the planned invasion of Venezuela. And I'm wondering how are people in Venezuela viewing this, which appears as yet another version of what one of the US's kind of constant low-grade attacks in its imperial warfare.
Yes, thank you again for having me. Yes, first of all, I want to say that when I was a freshman in New York, my first years, when I got to New York, the first police brutality case that I knew at the moment was the case of Amadou Diallo. And immediately I make the connection between police brutality and lynching, and sanctions and lynching. So this kind of policy is a policy that culturally is coming from the lynching mentality of the white supremacy people that are in the lead and leading the country right now. In terms of Venezuela, I can say that the United States is desperate to use the military force, but they know that will be painful. Then they know the United States has to pay a big price if they decide to get militarily against Venezuela. And that's why the United States has been trying to get support from Colombia, from Brazil, from several other countries around. And basically, they have been realizing that lately, all those allies that they have in the region are not very, are allies that probably will not be there for not too many time. For example, Bolsonaro is in a big trouble. He is in a process of impeachment right now. His sons are involved in some corruption cases, and his family is in a huge corrupt scandal. So he has a lot of problems, and probably he will not be able to end his mandate. And the same thing is happening with the Áñez in Bolivia, the dictator and the woman dictator in Bolivia, because basically she has been already connected to narco traffic. Her husband has been is very well connected with Uribe and with the narco traffic in Colombia, and some of her family's members also are part of the narco traffic. And there is a lot of corruption right now taking place in Bolivia. And the same thing is happening with Lenin Moreno in Ecuador. And the situation in Colombia is very difficult for Duque because Colombia Humana has been growing, increasing his forces internally, but also the leftist guerrilla movement is growing right now. It's something that is made a lot of people to be surprised that now the FARC is double the numbers of men with arms. So it's very difficult, the situation also for Duque. For that reason, we have been thinking here in Venezuela that the only way the United States is going to try, not one time, several times, is first of all to suffocate the economy of the country, and secondly, trying to send people that can just target some specific people in the government. President Maduro, some key figure in the government. So they want to create some chaos in the economy, and they want to target some very important political players in the Bolivarian revolution. And that will be happening, as I said before, several times. We need to be ready to be expecting several other groups trying to create chaos in Venezuela, coming to Venezuela with support from the United States.
All right, thank you, William. And Cynthia, we have a question in the chat here for we. How should this issue of sanctions and U.S. interventions be raised in the coming election when both candidates are imperialists? How should people, face this? How, with this election coming up, how should people be looking at this issue?
Yeah, the presidential election to me isn't very significant because we don't have candidates who are for peace or ending war, addressing climate catastrophe or anything else. So I think that congressional elections are much more important. And we do have some fairly progressive people running for Congress. And I would just like to say in answer to that question, to support Shahid Buttar, who's running against Nancy Pelosi in San Francisco. Support any candidates who are running against incumbent Democrats, if you can. So that's my answer to that. And I'd like to use the rest of my time to mention that tomorrow CodePINK is hosting a webinar on sanctions. It's called the Gendered Opposing Sanctions from a Feminist Imperative. I invite everybody to join that call, and I posted the link to register for the call in the chat. And then I would also like to echo what someone said earlier about what's going on in the United States right now, which is an uprising that we haven't seen the likes of in my lifetime. And right before this call, I was on the Movement for Black Lives call with the environmental justice organizations across the United States. There were over 1,000 people on that call to follow the leadership of the Movement for Black Lives. They have 3 demands: defund the police, fund Black communities and Black needs in the United States, and call for the resignation of Donald Trump. If they succeed with everyone's support, and I hope everyone will support this, this is the kind of power that we need to take. So I encourage everybody to get behind the Movement for Black Lives and the amazing organizing that they're doing around the United States, and join up with Juneteenth actions, hundreds of Juneteenth actions that are happening across the United States this weekend, starting this weekend. Please do join up with those and follow the Black leadership, because it's going to affect the sanctions issue. It's going to affect every issue. And one more thing I would like to add, echoing some comments earlier. The boot on the neck of George Floyd and all of the bullets that have caused the deaths of so many innocent Black people in the United States and people of color in the United States is the same boot that's on the neck of the countries that are suffering from US economic sanctions. It's the same. the same cause, the same motivation. It's the same thing. We need to actually connect all of these things together. Thank you, Joe, for your remarks about that. All of these things are connected. We have to stop United States racism. We have to stop United States white supremacy and end these wars, end these sanctions, and end this horrible police terror and the horrible police state that we are suffering right now. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. And we have, let's see, Ike Nahem is next. And we had a couple of questions relating to Cuba that you might be able to address. Ike, what explains the contradiction of the massive imperialist sanctions and Cuba's massive medical mobilization to combat COVID? And then also somebody asked, said they would love to know about the Cuban systems of patrols as compared to the US police.
Well, I would say the short answer to the questions is that Cuba made a socialist revolution back in 1959 that established putting in social terms, putting the working class and the oppressed and the Afro-Cubans and the poor peasants in power. And every institution in Cuba that developed out of that reflected that class transformation in Cuba. And the police, no less than any other institution in Cuba, because in the Cuban Revolution was not a change in governmental form through a election under the dominant capitalist system or a neo-colonial capitalist system, like happens in different democratic so-called interludes in Latin American history. This was an armed struggle against a US-backed military dictatorship that dissolved the existing police institutions, dissolved the existing army of the neo-colonial state, and rebuilt with different personnel from the working class and from the oppressed institutions that reflected that. So if you go to Cuba, and over the years, I've organized many delegations to Cuba, including several years ago, was part of a delegation that of family members of people that were murdered by NYPD that went down to Cuba, that got to see Cuban policing, that connections that had been made through our work to free the Cuban Five a few years back, where we made the connections with some of the, Anthony Baez, Ramarley Graham, many. I mean, you can list just in New York City, people murdered and gunned down by NYPD. So that connection is made. In fact, we're going to be having a July 5th webinar celebrating Frederick Douglass's speech, What is the 4th of July to a Slave? That's going to make some of those connections. But it's all the difference in the world. Anybody that goes to Cuba knows that the police presence there is like very laid back, and I could give many examples of it. But that's the essence. In the current period, for example, early on in the COVID crisis, the Cuban president announced that almost all of the prisons in Cuba were going to be, inmates were going to be released, and to stop the spread of COVID. Compare that to the United States. These disgusting detention centers for ICE and U.S. prisons, and the great Cuomo. What has he done around prison populations and so on and so forth. So that's the difference. All the difference in the world is when you make a socialist revolution in terms of being in a position to really resist, to organize, to do, despite the sanctions, despite everything, to still organize medical care, to make sure that you, as Fidel said, you don't share what's left over, but you organize to share what you have. And that's the principle Cuban internationalism from when they sent their army to smash the South Africans in the 70s and 80s to sending medical brigades today to 23 countries around the world.
All right, thank you. Thank you to all of our speakers who've been here with us tonight to talk about U.S. sanctions and intervention and the horrors of U.S. imperialism in all its forms. You know, as Cynthia mentioned earlier, I think U.S. sanctions on Iraq, even prior to the U.S. invasion in 2003, had killed 1 million Iraqis. The U.S. sanctions, a study found it killed over 40,000 Venezuelans. And you know, these sanction wars are just another weapon in the U.S. arsenal that they are using against their imperialist targets. And so thank you to everybody for being here tonight to talk about the fight back against these sanctions and what activists can do. And hopefully through your work and our work in Socialist Action, we can help the people who are in the streets right now realize, as Joe said earlier, that the struggle is international, and that the same oppression and strangulation by U.S. cops and in the war at home is done by the U.S., its armies abroad, and its economic sanctions, and in all of the horrors of U.S. imperialism. So thank you for being here tonight. Thank you to everyone watching for being here with us. And we are going to continue coming to you with our Monday night webinars. So watch our YouTube channel. Thank you.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, everybody. Goodbye.
Thank you, Nick.